We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
With the massive happenings through the courts of America and a new contentious effort from the ATF to impose regulations on law-abiding gun owners, it's high time to re-examine the state of the Second Amendment in the wake of the Supreme Court decision on Bruin versus National Rifle and Pistol Association. And who better to guide us through that than Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, host of the excellent Uprising podcast, and man about town, Mr. Scott DeCosenza, Esquire. Welcome back to the show, Scott.
Always a pleasure, Mark.
So, Scott, I think our audience is fairly familiar with what's been happening at the ATF, but if you could give us a brief review and then tell us the latest happening, because you're writing an article at the moment which implies that ATF officials may have to cancel their vacation.
Yes, well, Joe Biden's ATF, and it is important, I think, to kind of bring it home to the administration. It's not like this is some government functionaries, doing what they want on their own. This is an administration effort to frustrate gun ownership and transfer and purchase. They basically created a rule that said that anybody who had a certain type of firearm accessory had to register that like it was a machine gun, which means a hyper-regulatory environment for this item rather than the kind of normal regulatory environment that any handgun may undergo. The Congressional Research Service says this will affect between 10 and 40 million of these devices in public hands.
So presumably between 10 and 40 million individuals, Americans.
Well, you got to have a couple double purchasers within that mix, but most people probably don't have three of these things. And they have until the end of May to comply with this regulatory regime or suffer the consequences, which are becoming a federal felon. And we now have a host of groups that are suing the ATF in various jurisdictions to reverse this rule.
So let's talk about a few of these groups. I think probably the most notable one is a group of 25 attorneys general, and I hope I got the S on the correct word in that.
The plural possessive, always a favorite.
Okay, so what's their argument here that they're applying to the courts for?
Well, that suit that you're referring to was filed in, I believe, North Dakota federal court. And so some of this, the kind of deeper discussion about this is where they filed, because that may have the reason why we discuss that is because the chances of success may be greater. In all the cases that we're discussing, they're Republican appointed judges. And I think it was a Trump appointee who's in that North Dakota case. And that suit was filed by SB Tactical, I believe, which is a pistol brace manufacturer. And it was joined by almost all the Republican attorneys general states. So I think it's 25. Texas, by the way, we'll discuss that in a second. They went with a different suit. And that case is also now being funded by the NRA. So that's the NRA and all the Republican attorneys general. And the arguments in their case are, and in many of these, probably, well, it's fair to say all the cases, there are two main arguments. One is that the ATF is engaged in impermissible lawmaking with their proposed rule. And the other is, of course, that it violates the Second Amendment, especially in light of the recent Bruin decision from the Supreme Court.
Let's dig a little bit into this, Scott. You say that essentially the ATF is creating law from whole cloth, really, because how does that work? We kind of assume that when a federal agency sets a rule, then there would need to be some kind of congressional agreement with that to make it a law, right? But what they're doing here is, I guess it's what a lot of people accuse judges of doing, legislating from the bench.
And this is legislating from the federal, basically the federal bureaucracy, excuse me. This happens quite a bit. It's oftentimes not discussed or revealed because it's not in terribly contentious areas, but in minor areas it happens all the time. And what happens is the Congress says the federal government is to regulate, for instance, long arms, rifles and shotguns differently than handguns. Well, what makes those things a handgun or a shotgun or a rifle? We may all have our understanding about what those things are, but articulating them into laws that are then going to be used to prosecute people for violating them, they're going to be challenged, and they have to be carefully constructed, as you might imagine. So that's what this whole controversy entails. For people who aren't in the gun culture, this is a firearm accessory that allows people to basically create a shorter package of a firearm that fires a cartridge that is typically associated with a rifle caliber, 223 or well, that's the most popular one. That's the native caliber for the AR-15. And so it became a wildly popular accessory, and it's sort of, the latest and greatest of any kind of phrase, or sweeping kind of trend. And that's what's happened with this. This has only been around for like 10 years. And Mark, what happened was the people who manufactured this brace sent letters to the ATF and said, is it okay to make this? Does it constitute basically a short-barreled rifle? And the ATF said no. And they're the only ones who can say, because they're the ones who determine under the rulemaking authority what it means to be a rifle or a handgun. So Congress needs to get in there and really. I see you want to come in. I'm sorry.
I do.
Am I rambling on too long?
No, that's great. That's great information. What I want to kind of get a grip on here is, you mentioned that it's coming in South Dakota. It's been filed, and that's specifically
that's
because
the NRA suit.
That's the NRA suit, because there's a higher likelihood of success. Now, what does a success look like in this case? Is it the ATF has to repeal the new ruling that would, I don't know if this is a real word, felonize between 10 and 40 million Americans? Would they have to repeal that? Or
what success would look like is that a federal judge, or in that instance, I think it might be a magistrate judge who the case is currently assigned to, in any case, that they issue a stay, that they say this ruling is likely to be overturned at a trial, and so therefore we're going to implement a bar that prohibits the government from implementing this rule. Full stop. And then people who own these devices don't have to worry about anything in the intermediate time. And then there'll be a more lengthy case that's presented in court with witnesses, a real trial over the issue, and then a ruling that indeed they were right, meaning the court that granted the stay in the first place was right, that this does violate either the ATF's authority or the Second Amendment or both. And then that decision from the district court is affirmed at the circuit court level. That would be really the complete. And if you want to go one step further, that they appeal to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court either declines to take the appeal or takes it and then affirms it. That's what victory looks like, whether that's for the NRA case, whether that's for the ATF case, whether that's for the Gun Owners of America case, or that's for the Second Amendment Foundation cases, which are the three big ones on the board currently. And there's more, I'm sure, that I don't know of, and probably some more that will be filed between now and May 31st.
Now, again, Scott, we often end up coming back to this because it seems that law in America, and that's really what our Talking Liberty segments are often about, law to really have a clear and bright line ruling, as you may or may not get from the Supreme Court. It seems to me that this is a question beyond the scope of pistol braces, the ATF. It's who has the authority to make something a crime in the United States. Now,
yes,
we say that this is obviously appears to be taking place with the ATF, but the EPA has also been involved in this as well. And it seems to me that there isn't, or maybe there is, some kind of bright line ruling at the very highest court or courts in the land that says no federal agency, anything outside of Congress, has the ability to felonize or even misdemeanor somebody.
What you're discussing is called the delegation doctrine, right? And can Congress delegate its lawmaking authority to federal agencies? And there's a great tension in there. Typically, conservatives and libertarians are saying absolutely not. It's not okay for them. There's a very good reason why Congress has lawmaking authority and the executive does not, and that the courts do not. Now, typically on the Democrat and the lefty side of things, they are much more interested in lawmaking through the federal agencies. It gives them, they're I mean, let's be honest, they're relatively speaking, they're captured by the left, these large agencies, right? And so if they have lawmaking authority, then they can do through agency action what they could never do, through the political process of legislating in the Congress.
Okay, Scott DiCosenza, thank you ever so much.
Thanks, Mark.
And that's almost it for this edition of Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'd like to thank our guests, Dave Patterson, Andrew Moran, and Scott DiCosenza. And of course, my appreciation to you, the listeners, for taking the time to tune in. And my final thought for this week, I just want to take a moment to consider something. A government that refuses to act. It refuses to keep its citizens informed of unidentified threats. And one that, parallel with this, is overseeing the financial destruction of the middle class. Now, what kind of government is that? And perhaps a more important question might be, in whose interest is such a government operating? Something to ponder there, I think. Thanks for listening. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides. Entertaining, informative, and just plain fun. Watch Liberty Nation's The Conservative 5. Produced by conservatives for conservatives. C5's The Left Free Zone. Hosted by Liberty Nation's Lisa K. Donner. Joined by a raucous, irreverent panel of authors. Deconstructing leftist narratives. Debating the hot topics. And remembering to laugh. Join the official conservative safe
You only
space.
did that to piss Jeff off.
Liberty Nation's The Conservative 5.